Hello students, welcome to Shourabh Sir classes. My name is Professor Himadri Datta. In today's lecture, we'll talk about adaptive expectation and inflation inertia. In the earlier video, we talked about the basics of Phillips curve, how do we derive Phillips equation. In this video, we'll talk about the expectation aspect of Phillips curve. That is, in this video, we'll talk about adaptive expectation. So what is adaptive expectation? Before getting into adaptive expectation, first we'll write the Phillips curve equation, which is pi, this is inflation, depends on the expected inflation the cyclical unemployment and supply shock. So the inflation depends on the expected inflation, cyclical unemployment and supply shock. Here in adaptive expectation, we usually take one lag variable as equals to the expected value of inflation term, which is expectation of inflation equals to that is pi t, say pi t depends on pi t minus 1 minus buc plus v. So in adaptive expectation, we can see there is a relationship of pi t, which is inflation of this year, depends on the inflation of previous years, the cyclical unemployment, and V, which is the supply shock. Now, this is also known as inflation inertia. That is, it leaves an inertia of previous year inflation on current year's inflation. This is known as inflation inertia. Before getting into inflation inertia, first we'll make two assumptions, that is the V, which is supply shock, and UC, which is cyclical unemployment, remains constant, that is at natural level of unemployment. So the first two assumptions of inflation inertia is supply shock and cyclical unemployment is constant at UN. So usually, as these two terms are constant, the inflation of this year depends on previous year's inflation. This is known as inflation inertia. Now, here we'll see now we'll show this equation with the we'll explain this equation with the help of a diagram. Now how can we do this? Suppose this is fixed, the natural level at unemployment is fixed at this level, and at this level, and say inflation is this is PC1, which is nothing but Phillips curve 1, UN is fixed at this level. Now see, now due to some reason, let's say for an example, if price increases due to an expansionary monetary policy, let's say the Phillips curve shift rightward. How it shifts rightward, that we'll discuss in a minute. But now for the timing, just say the Phillips curve shifts rightward to PC2, from PC1 to PC2. Now as you can see, given the natural rate of unemployment rate, the inflation has risen from pi 1 to pi 2. So here this can be shown as this, that is, as expectation of inflation has increased due to this increase in money supply, the Phillips curve has shifted rightward. Now how expectation of inflation changes? Let's say for an example, suppose government increases money supply. As government increases money supply, this ultimately leads to increase in price level. That is, there is inflation. Now, as price level has increased, the Phillips curve is expected to move rightward, given the fact the people form their expectation of this from the previous year's inflation. Now, if previous year's inflation is, let's say 5, people will expect that this year the expected inflation would be equal to the previous year's inflation. This is why we call it inflation inertia. Now due to this increase in price level, what will happen? Due to this increase in price level, let's say people had incorporated this inflation and they have changed their expectation, or they have increased their expectation, which is this. So this entire curve shifts rightward from this to this. Given natural rate of unemployment rate, as you can see, ultimately leads to increase in inflation. So due to increase in expectation of inflation, which depends on previous year's inflation, we can say that Phillips curve shifts rightward and it leads to more inflation. Now, with the help of a AS and AT diagram, we'll show how increase in money supply causes Phillips curve to shift rightward and how this inflation inertia takes place. Okay. Now, first we'll draw ADA's curve. So this is aggregate demand curve, this is short run aggregate supply curve, this is long run aggregate supply curve. Now suppose government increases money supply. This government decides to increase, the central bank let's say central bank decides to increase the money supply. So it will lead to increase relative price of increase in relative price of different goods and commodities. So inflation is likely to rise. But how this will happen? See, due to increase in money supply, what will happen? People will have more money in their hand. So, which will eventually lead to higher consumption. So, the aggregate demand curve itself will shift rightward. see, as you can see, price level has increased and also the YN level. Now, given the assumption of sticky wage model, as income has increased, the output has increased, price has increased, but wage is fixed, what will happen? Thus, average supply curve will shift rightward again. So, this will be like this. So, if we shift further to Y2, the output level will increase with an increasing inflation level. So, from here we can see that how money supply affects inflation. That is, due to by implementing this expansionary monetary policy, the inflation has increased. Now, in most of the developed countries like USSA, the current year inflation usually depend on previous year inflation, because the expected inflation is the inflation rate always over the years are same, unless there is like some kind of supply shock, or there is like various factors which affect inflation rate. That is, unless there is any such thing, that is, there is no supply shock issues or there is no such other issues, usually the expected inflation always depends on the previous year's inflation rate. That is, there is always this chance of inertia, inflation inertia, which always keeps on going. So for countries like USA, unless there is any such factors which affect the inflation rate, always remember one thing, that is, expected inflation depends on previous year's inflation. That is, it follows an inertia. But now there are two factors, V and UC, which we assume to be constant in the model. Now, if they changes, what happens? We'll see it in the next video. We'll call it either demand push or demand pull or cost push approach. And here we have just shown what is adaptive expectation. That is, the inflation of this year depends on inflation of previous year plus V, supply shock. So inflation of this year depends on inflation of previous years. This is UC, which is cyclical unemployment, and V, which is supply shock. So it follows an inertia, which is known as inflation inertia. Now, in the next video, we'll talk about the assumption we made here. There's this in this to be constant. We'll reduce these two assumptions, and so we'll talk about those two models, and also we'll show how disinflation takes place and what is sacrifice ratio in this context. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any doubt or query, or if you have any suggestion to give, please, I'm writing down my WhatsApp number. You can WhatsApp me on this number, 9836793076. Thank you for watching today's video. Have a nice day ahead.